Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hi, thank you for downloading and listening to this episode with Professor Cecile Wright. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank those that have been emailing. I've had a few messages of thanks, which is always really, really lovely to hear. And I've also had some requests for people to interview. So I can let you know that coming up in the next month or so, I am going to be speaking to Caroline Jackson, talking about her research on gender in education, lads and ladettes and all of that sort of stuff. I'll be talking to Mike Savage, talking about social class. Quite a few of you have requested Mike. And also Sudhir Venkatesh, who you probably know from the Gang Leader for a Day research as well. If there is anyone else you'd like me to research, I will do my best, see if I can get hold of an interview with them. Send me the name of the person you'd like me to speak to. And that email is thesociologypodcast@gmail.com. Okay, thesociologypodcast@gmail.com. So my guest for this episode was Professor Cecile Wright. You may have encountered her work before. She writes extensively about ethnicity and inequality, particularly within education. She's written about loads of different areas over the years, talking about experiences from primary school, how teachers interact and label students differently, ethnocentric curriculums, and even her research more up to date about why black boys are underperforming in education, how they're still viewed in a negative way despite all the progress we've supposedly made. I thought it was really interesting to also hear from Cecile about her own heritage and her upbringing and background, and that really helped to give me an understanding of why she's been so effective in her writing over the years. So I hope you enjoy this one. Hi, thanks for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
I'm Professor Cecile Wright. I'm an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham in the School of Sociology and Social Policy. And I've been in the department since 2011.
Excellent. And what's your history in the subject of sociology, Cecile?
My history in the subject. I did O-level sociology, A-level sociology, went on to University of Nottingham to read psychology, interestingly, with sociology as a sub-sid, but I majored in both psychology and sociology. After graduating from the University of Nottingham, I worked as a research assistant for about 18 months, and then I applied for a scholarship, the Economic and Research Council scholarship, to do a PhD at the University of Kiel. I graduated from Kiel in the mid-80s, and I really got my first academic position in sociology at the University of Sheffield, then the University of Leicester. Then I went to Nottingham Trent University, where I became a professor in sociology in 2000, and from then I went on to where I currently am at the University of Nottingham.
Brilliant, excellent. And actually, I think it would be quite useful for listeners to know about your kind of heritage and your upbringing as well, because that obviously that helps us to understand your research.
Absolutely. I'm the daughter of the eldest of 9 children. So my parents came here as young adults. They were in their early 20s when they came to the UK. My father came before my mother, and then my mother followed a year or so after. My father came to the, as it were, to the city of Nottingham for a short while, and then he moved to Derby, and he was employed within the construction industry, working for British Rail, as it were. My mother then followed him, as I said, a year to 18 months after, and my mother came up to train as a nurse. So my parents really typify the whole narrative around the Windrush generation, that were invited here as young adults to help build the country coming out of the Second World War, when you had policies that were about implementing a welfare state that has since dwindled, and we're now appreciating in this COVID crisis the importance of having an effective welfare state. My mother came obviously to work in the health service. The health service came out of Labour government policy after the Second World War to establish a national health service. And then in terms of my own, as a child here, I grew up in Derby when my parents moved to, I went to school in Derby, infant school, primary school, secondary school. I went on to the college where I did my A-levels, and then went on to the University of Nottingham, as I've just highlighted.
Great. And what was the ethnic makeup of Derby at the time when you were growing up? Were you very much in a minority yourself?
Absolutely. What happened in terms of the demographics of the city? Well, my parents came to the city, Nottingham and then Derby, came to the city because they had families and friends from Jamaica. So the whole migration situation in the city of Derby, and I should imagine it's the same across many of our conurbations, is that people either came to join spouse or siblings who had already resided here in the city, in the city of Derby, or they came to join others who came from a similar part of the Caribbean, part of Jamaica, so to speak. So we were, I would say, those from the Windrush generation were the first migrants to come after the Second World War. Clearly you had, at that time, you had the Polish and you had the Italians, so other Europeans had come either prior to fight in the war or after. But in terms of non-white migrants, the Windrush generation were in fact the first Commonwealth, those from the Commonwealth countries who, as I said, were invited to help build the country following the Second World War. In terms of the experience as migrants, as children of migrants, it was basically, my recollection was one of running the gauntlet of racism, oppression. In terms of where we lived, there were other people from Jamaica or other islands, and as more joined the locality, so we lived in the inner city, which typifies the pattern across the country then. As immigrants moved in, the white residents moved out, so we experienced the white flight.
Yeah.
Joining the primary school, I recall that I was the black child. At school, the secondary school, out of hundreds, I would have been a handful. So it was pretty difficult in terms of having a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And of course, Derby, along with other cities during the 70s, the 60s, well, the late 60s, 70s and 80s were involved in local riots. That really was a case of young black people, youth in particular within the city, feeling marginalised, feeling disaffected, feeling discriminated against, and suffering racism. So we had in the city, alongside Birmingham, Manchester, Nottingham, we had our fair share of young people taking to the street, demanding justice, demanding equality, demanding better treatment within the education system. Because whilst I was in the system, we had seminal pieces of research about the experience of immigrant children in the schooling system. And Bernard Cord, a well-known scholar at that time, did a piece of action research where he articulated what was then how the British education system created for black children in the school then a situation of underachievement, deficit. So how the education system made immigrant children educationally subnormal. Just to paraphrase the title of his book. So my entire biography in terms of experiencing work actually in the education system has been one of pioneer, and it's not a badge that I wear with pride because there's a price to pay for being pioneering. I mean, I was the first black female professor in the East Midlands.
Wow.
When I became a professor in 2000, and throughout my working life, I would say I have, and continue to, perhaps less so now, experience difficulties, challenging situations that reflected my intersectionality, really, being black, female and working class. And I think it is lamentable that we are seeing in the current situation, particularly during the Brexit era, some of the experiences of belonging, rejection, being unearthed by the debate around migration, immigrants, that came out of, that I think is illustrated by the Windrush scandal, where I think it's a signifier, really, of how the contemporary situation in terms of non-white people, the whole debate, toxic debate around migration. I think the Windrush scandal, whereby people who came at the period that I've just spoken about came to the country in the late 40s, 50s and 60s by invitation to work and build the country, and that incidentally my parents came as British citizens, found themselves in 2016 being deemed as illegal immigrants. Shocking. Simply because they were not able to, although that many had been in the country for over 70 years, they didn't have the documentation that was required to actually prove that they were in fact British citizens. The upshot of that is that we've seen people who were deported to supposedly country of origin. So what I'm trying to say basically, that some of the narratives about who is British, sense of belonging, who is legitimate in terms of citizenship, have in fact, those narratives have come to the fore in the contemporary context of Windrush it.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Cecile. Having heard your upbringing now, it makes total sense for anyone that knows your sociological work as to why you went into that field. For those people that perhaps don't know too much about your writing, do you want to just give us a bit of a flavour of some of the main research that you've done over the last 20, 30 years?
Yes, absolutely. Right. Invariably, based on the potted history I've given you, my passion in terms of my research and focus, let me say, in terms of sociology, the critical moment for me as a pupil, a student, in terms of wanting to engage with the sociological imagination, came out of the literature that I read when I did my O-level sociology and subsequently A-level. And some of the key literature, I'll just highlight two. The seminal piece of work by Paul Willis, Learning to Labour, about structural inequality and how that is reproduced within certain state institution, namely education. And also the publication by Bowles and Gintis about how capitalism in America created educational inequality. Those seminal books, as I would say, spoke to me in terms of giving me some sort of understanding or hooks to try and make sense of what I saw around me, issues around me sociologically of social deprivation and inequality. They spoke, in terms of education, they spoke to my experience of education. Now, I think a traumatic moment in my education happened at the infant school that I attended. I think I would have been about 5.5 or 6 years old. And I remember at the primary school, we were required at the end of the week to do our weekly spelling test. We were given 10 words, and we had to learn those words. So we were given those words every Friday, and the following Friday we were tested on these words. And I remember I used to get many of the words right, many of the spellings correct. But I was doubted. The teacher, I kept being accused of cheating.
Right.
I was accused of cheating. And I think it made, and reflecting on it now, that I experienced a considerable amount of confusion. I became very fearful about schooling. I became very fearful about learning, and I was in this this juxtaposition in that in terms of my family, my parents were very, very, very keen on educational success.
Yeah.
They always articulated that education could be a route through which one could exert a degree of control in one's adult life. So they saw education as the gate to adult economic success. My parents used to say, once you've got your qualifications, it doesn't matter what colour you are.
Yeah.
It opens doors. So I had the pressure from home, we all did, to be educationally successful. So my parents were very, very diligent about us doing schoolwork, very, very diligent. However, I felt at the time that school, certainly the private school at that time, and it was an experience, an encounter that I had in different forms as I progressed through the education system, that there was always a doubt about my educational ability, or always a doubt. So when I engage with the two pieces of sociological literature that I described, those two authors, sociologists, spoke to me in the sense that it gave me an understanding of the confusion, the juxtaposition that I was in, the juxtaposition being namely black, working class and female, and the whole issue about expectations in terms of who gains from education, what education is about, and the reproductive nature of education.
Yeah.
And those sorts of structural elements have informed my work in the sense that my work has focused on education, so experiences of those with the undesirable identity or structural position.
Yeah.
Or, more specifically, what Pierre Bourdieu tells us in terms of his theoretical articulation, about the reproductive nature of education in the sense that it reproduces social inequality. It was through education, I think, I researched in terms of educational experiences and outcome, that I was able to not only look at the site education itself as a site for reproducing inequality, it also gave me an opportunity to look at other social institutions and the role that they play as well. So my work is not just about education per se, it also looks at what happens to those individuals in terms of their destination and trajectory once they have gone through the process, very much along the lines, as I said, of Paul Willis' Learning to Labour.
The Learning to Labour, yeah.
Indeed.
It's interesting that you mentioned your experience of primary school, actually, because the first piece of your work that really I became aware of was the race relations in the primary school, which was what, early 90s, is that?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you mind just saying a little bit about that? Because that was very much, that must have been influenced by your own experiences to want to study that area.
Yes, it was. It was. Although I've looked at education across the sectors. To be honest with you, it's not just primary, secondary, and I've done stuff in further and higher. And that my forthcoming book, you will see that it looks at trajectory and experiencing in compulsory and post-compulsory education sector. Yes, the book on primary school relations, looking once again at how children are othered because of their structural position, and once again those intersecting elements of because of their class position, their racialised position, and because of their gender also. And when I recall the work I did at the ethnographic study, because what I have done methodologically is that I tried to take a mixed methodological approach.
Yeah.
That yes, you look at the statistics, etc. But I've also, in terms of my work, it's about situating, contextualising the data within the actual lived experience and encounters. And I suppose going into those primary schools and seeing how children were encountered their daily schooling was quite traumatic, actually, when I reflect, because yes, you are right, perhaps I was reliving my experience. So it's traumatic, the level of hostility that children experience at the hands of peers, actually, but also teachers' expectations, again, was surprising, given that we were talking about the 90s when we had the Swan Report. So there had been key literature and the research in terms of race and education sociology was becoming a respectable and a growing area. So the awareness and the research and the data was there. And I suppose that was being fed back into policy and how teachers were trained and educated. So I think it was quite disconcerting to see that for children at that formative stage of their education had to learn skills. They encountered or had to project what Bourdieu tells us, the appropriate habitus, so the appropriate disposition, the appropriate way of being to be taken seriously within that educational context. However, if I were to go back and do that work again, what was quite encouraging about that piece of work was this, that irrespective of children having to navigate a situation, some children, black children, Asian children, having to navigate a context that was not always supportive of them as children wanting to be educated. What was really encouraging in terms of that work was the extent to which those children and their families bought into education. They saw it. You see, their perception and how the value that they placed on schooling, the value was that even though they were being educated in working class deprived areas with working class white children, their values in terms of education and what education could do reflected the narrative of the immigrant, being that through education, and that narrative of of what education can offer them is not only an immigrant narrative, but it's also a middle class narrative. So their disposition is that education can become the tool through which one, in terms of future destination, can exert a degree of control.
Yeah, sort of a route
to... that was quite uplifting, yeah.
So I was going to say kind of a route to social mobility. Education is...
Absolutely.
And I think you're the first person that I ever saw write the term or the ideas of ethnocentricity, ethnocentric curriculums and so on. Could you say a little bit about that?
The discipline and working within the discipline, I'd like to think that it's also about self-growth and how one look at the range of conceptual framework to give some sort of an understanding to what one is trying to convey.
Yeah.
I would say that I'd probably use that concept then. I wouldn't now. I would use the concept of post-colonial narrative, because, yes, that's what I would use. And by that, why would I do that? Because I would say that how one understands the situation or the encounter, the interaction that one is trying to convey, capture, in addition to reporting what is there and analysing what is there, I think one needs to bring to that situation some sort of historical context.
Yeah.
And I think the post-colonial theory concepts allows that approach has allowed me to contextualise the contemporary within some sort of of a historical framework. So the post-colonial has offered me the way by which I can articulate the fact that there is a narrative within our culture and way of being that is not just created in the contemporary, the immediate, that those values have been transmitted across time and space, in the same way in which issue around identity have a historical context to them. And so in terms of ethnocentrism of the curriculum, what I would say today is this, going back to that broader macro understanding of how the state apparatus reproduces the power domain, the sites of power and control. I would say that part of that is about the values and the message you convey to your citizens, your future citizens. And the curriculum is there to reproduce, and I'm not articulating this in any sort of simplistic way. It's there to represent and reproduces the values and the worldview of those that are powerful. So and I think the theoretical framework or conceptualisation that one can draw from the post-colonial work allows one to understand that very much in the way which I would say a parallel situation in which patriarchal power is reproduced, and understanding historically how that is reproduced in the way in terms of male and female power dynamics and relationships.
Because I know you've written quite extensively about educational performance and so on as well, particularly of black groups. So do you think that's the biggest factor that causes a discrepancy in terms of educational success?
I think it's interesting just to use a contemporary situation in terms of educational outcome. As a result of the COVID crisis, schools, as you know, the education system is affected by this crisis we're in at the moment, and of course it has disrupted the education of our children, young people across the sector. And it is said, it is going to happen, I think, that for young people who are hoping to go on to higher education in the autumn, because it is unlikely that they will go through the normal process of sitting there, A-levels, etc., that in deciding whether they have the prerequisite, the qualification to go on to university in the autumn, that the sitting of A-levels, for example, will not happen, and that the judgment about whether they meet the prerequisite or qualified to then participate in higher education, that judgment will be made by the teachers, by the school. So it will be made they will be assessed by ways that are not usual. And I think that suggests, I have all sorts of issues, and I think I've written about this, about how that's going to impact on black young people who would have sat their exams, A-level exams this summer, because we know from the work I've done and others that when it comes to teachers and schools having to use their discretion, which is what this assessment will be partly about, that it works against the interests of black children, particularly black males, because bias tends to be far more prominent for certain groups than others. So, but the point I'm trying to make, educational outcome, if one take, going back to what I was saying about the post-colonial concept, framework for understanding what is happening within our systems and how different groups experience our systems, for me, educational outcome and the book that is about to come out, it's not just about the qualification that you get at the end of it. It's a process.
Yeah.
So I've always looked at, in my work, the structures, how they're mediated, and the process involved, and the outcome that emanates from that mediation.
Can I just ask you to expand on one little bit more? Because you mentioned black boys in particular, and I know that's a key part of a lot of your work. What do you think are the other big obstacles for black boys in terms of educational attainment? Because for a long while, that has been a group that's been of concern, hasn't it?
Indeed. I'll take this opportunity before I respond fully to give you the title of my forthcoming book
please
that's
do.
coming out in the autumn, hopefully all being well. The title of the book is Young British, African and Caribbean Men Achieving Educational Success.
Yeah.
Subtitle Disrupting Deficient Discourses About Black Males' Achievement. Okay, so why has schooling been continued to be challenging, problematic for young black men? Well, not just schooling, education, because it's through the whole sector. Because in the book, it looks at compulsory and post-compulsory experiences. So those that have completed their A-levels, gone on to university, their experience of being in secondary schooling and their experience of being in higher education. Why has it been problematic for young black men? Well, I suppose it's as problematic as it is for young black men in other spheres of our society, in the sense that young black men, young boys, they enter the schooling system, they achieve relatively well until about the age of 11. Then they start on the process or the trajectory of underperforming. Our society, our education system, had difficulties, I think, with black masculinity.
Yeah.
It's not just about class. There is a problem with engaging with, supporting, and accepting black masculinity in our society. Black masculinity in terms of society historically has always been associated with danger. So what starts in the education system in terms of underachievement, negativity, being disproportionately caught up in school exclusions, that sort of pattern and trajectory then follow through into entry into the criminal justice system. So black men are disproportionately in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Black men, irrespective of their qualifications, are likely to be in jobs that are not reflective of their qualifications. So there is, in terms of race and oppression, it is compounded by being a black male, irrespective of one social class. And I have personally seen that in terms of my own children. I have 2 sons who have certainly encountered difficulties in terms of their educational performance at higher education level.
And this is perhaps a difficult question to answer, but why do you think it's perhaps more apparent in black males than some other ethnic minorities? You know, if we look at sort of Chinese and Indian pupils, for example, they tend to do quite well, and particularly in higher education as well. Why do you think it's particularly an issue with black groups and black males in particular?
Yeah, it's well, once again, one can draw on some of the post-colonial theories in terms of the history and the narrative we have about blackness, but blackness and masculinity. And incidentally, may I say that Asian males of Muslim background are also experiencing similar negativity and oppression. So if you go into the criminal justice system, you will see disproportionately Asian men of Muslim background. If you look at educational underachievement, it's Muslim men of criminal Muslim men that are underachieving and so forth. And in terms of in terms of employment, once again, if you look at the employment pattern of Muslim men from certain cultural groups, ethnic groups, you'll see that the disproportionality in terms of opportunity parallels the situation of black men.
Yeah.
In my work, I've tried to articulate how the culture society receives, and perceives black men. I think black men are often seen as a danger within. Similarly, Muslim men are seen as the danger within.
Has you've obviously been researching this for a number of years now. Have you seen improvements, Cecile? Has it got better? I'm imagining that the overt racism is perhaps being replaced by institutional or more covert. But have you seen improvements and developments at all?
Relatively speaking, in the sense that there's probably slightly better representation, and I suppose that could be the part of turning the narrative around. But the embedded structural elements is very, very difficult to dislodge. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, you see black men in Parliament, so they're there as parliamentary representatives. You see them in some of the professions, but there's still exclusion as such. So you are beginning to see representation in some of the exclusionary sectors of society. So in that respect, things have marginally, but there is still gross disparity and disproportionality. So, has the situation improved? Well, why is there proportionately more black men in prison than there are as students at the Russell Group universities?
Yeah.
Is that an improvement? So, it's not, progress is not there. Progress is not there, or it's not going fast enough.
Yeah. Certainly. Cecile, could you tell us, you said that's your most recent book. Could you tell us a little bit more about perhaps what you're working on at the moment, or how people could get in touch with you if they wanted more information or to read your work?
Yeah. Well, the book is forthcoming. Can't give a specific date because of the COVID crisis that is affecting us all, really. The publishers are Routledge, that's based in New York. So it's likely to come out later in the year. And all I suggest is that the publishers will obviously promote the book. So you will see it promoted in the various locations where new publications are promoted. But just check, I would suggest that you just check Routledge catalogue. It'll be published in one of their catalogues, I'm sure.
Great. And people can follow you on Twitter as well. And
Absolutely. I will post it when it's actually out. I'll put up the information for people to actually, to make it available to whoever wish to get hold of the copy.
That's fantastic. Professor Cecile Wright, thank you very much for your time and giving up your afternoon to be able to talk to me. I really, really appreciate it.
Right, thank you very much for the invitation.
No problem. Thank you.
All the best.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.